She hid my adoption papers for 20 years. I found them in a shoebox. I want to start with that sentence, because for the better part of my adult life, I believed a version of my own origin story that turned out to be only partially true. A version my older sister had quietly, deliberately protected for 2 decades, long after she had every reason to simply tell me the truth. I want to tell you what I eventually discovered, and what happened once I did, because I think if you've ever had someone you trusted decide, on your behalf, which parts of your own life you deserve to know about, you already understand the particular kind of betrayal I'm describing. Hello, and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about the moments people finally recover the truth about their own lives, however long it took to arrive, and however complicated the reasons someone else decided to withhold it. If any part of this story feels close to your own experience, I hope you'll stay until the end. My name is Anna. I am 34 years old, and 3 years ago I discovered, entirely by accident, that I had been adopted as an infant. A fact my older sister Renee had known for the entirety of our shared childhood, and had specifically, deliberately worked to keep hidden from me for over 2 decades. I want to tell you about our family first, because I think the shape of what happened only makes sense once you understand the particular dynamics we grew up inside. Our mother, Margaret, raised Renee and me largely on her own after our father passed away when I was 4 years old, a car accident that Renee, 6 years older than me, remembers with considerably more clarity and grief than I ever could, given how young I was at the time. Our mother worked as an elementary school teacher for over 30 years, a modest, steady income that nonetheless allowed her to provide a genuinely stable, loving home for the 2 of us throughout our childhood. I remember, growing up, a house filled with the specific, comfortable rhythms of a working single mother's careful budgeting, homemade birthday cakes rather than store-bought ones, secondhand clothes that our mother somehow always managed to make feel special rather than lacking, summer trips to a modest lake cabin an aunt owned rather than anywhere more expensive. All of it delivered with such genuine warmth and resourcefulness that neither Renee nor I ever felt, as children, that we were missing anything significant compared to our more affluent classmates. I grew up believing, entirely and without question, that Renee and I were both our mother's biological daughters, born 6 years apart, a story so consistently reinforced throughout my childhood that I never had any reason to question it. I resembled neither of my parents particularly closely, a fact I attributed, without much thought, to the ordinary genetic variation that occurs within any family, a slightly different combination of features from distant relatives on one side or the other. Renee, by contrast, closely resembled our mother, the same dark hair, the same particular way of narrowing her eyes when concentrating, similarities that again I never once thought to interrogate as evidence of anything beyond ordinary family resemblance. I remember, specifically, a family reunion when I was around 10 years old, an elderly great-aunt commenting within my earshot that I must take after your father's side entirely, a comment I absorbed without any particular alarm at the time, simply another piece of ordinary extended family commentary about resemblance and genetics that children hear constantly without much scrutiny. I think about that comment often now, understanding, with the benefit of everything I eventually learned, that at least some members of our extended family likely knew the truth about my origins. Even as small, offhand comments like that one continued being made around me throughout my childhood without any deliberate intention to reveal anything. I want to tell you about my relationship with Renee throughout our childhood and early adulthood, because I think understanding its specific texture matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Renee and I were never particularly close, even as children, a distance I always attributed to our 6-year age gap and our genuinely different temperaments, Renee more reserved and controlled, me considerably more impulsive and emotionally expressive. Our mother often remarked, affectionately, that we were different as night and day, a comment I always understood as simple, ordinary sibling variation rather than anything more significant. I remember specifically how Renee handled our father's death very differently than I did, given our respective ages at the time. She was 10, old enough to remember him clearly, old enough to grieve him in a fully formed, articulate way that I, at 4, simply couldn't access in the same manner. I think, Looking back now, that this early, formative grief shaped Renee's personality considerably. A certain guardedness, a tendency to manage her emotions through control and competence rather than open expression, traits that served her well, eventually in her chosen legal career, but that also, I think, made genuine emotional closeness between us more difficult to build throughout our shared childhood. As we grew into adulthood, this distance persisted, though it rarely calcified into outright conflict. Renee moved 2 states away for college and remained there afterward, building a career in corporate law, visiting our childhood home perhaps twice a year for holidays. I stayed considerably closer to home, eventually working as an elementary school counselor, a career choice our mother always beamed about, telling anyone who would listen that I'd followed directly in her own professional footsteps, helping children navigate difficult emotional terrain the same way she had for 30 years in her own classroom. I want to tell you about our mother's final illness, because it matters enormously for understanding both what I eventually discovered and how I eventually discovered it. Our mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 4 years ago, a diagnosis that came, unfortunately, at an advanced stage, giving her doctors relatively limited options for meaningful long-term treatment. She lived for approximately 14 months following that diagnosis, months I spent as much as my work schedule allowed, driving the 40 minutes to her house several times weekly, managing her care alongside a rotating team of hospice professionals during her final months. I remember those 14 months with a particular, complicated intensity. The same instinctive attentiveness I brought to my counseling work applied now to my own mother's physical and emotional needs, coordinating her pain management with her oncology team, sitting with her through the specific, difficult grief of watching her own body fail her steadily, week by week. There were afternoons during that period when she talked, softly, about her life, her marriage to our father, her early years as a young mother, memories she seemed to want to revisit and preserve, as clearly as possible while she still had the clarity and strength to share them. Renee, given her distance and demanding legal career, visited less frequently during this period, though I want to be fair and note that she did make genuine efforts, flying in for several extended weekends throughout those 14 months, and handling, from her own distance, a significant portion of the complicated insurance and medical billing logistics that our mother's illness generated, a contribution I genuinely appreciated at the time, understanding that caregiving takes many different forms, and that Renee's particular skills lent themselves naturally to this specific kind of logistical support. Our mother passed away 3 years ago, at home, with both Renee and me present during her final hours, a peaceful passing that I remain grateful for, even now, understanding how much more difficult and traumatic her death could easily have been given the specific nature of her illness. I want to walk you through the months following her death, because the discovery I eventually made didn't happen immediately, but rather emerged slowly, unexpectedly, nearly 2 years after her passing, during a period when I assumed the major logistics of her estate had long since been settled. In the immediate aftermath of our mother's death, Renee and I worked together, reasonably cooperatively, to settle her modest estate, our childhood home, a small retirement account, and various personal belongings accumulated over her lifetime. Our mother's will, drafted years earlier, divided everything equally between the two of us, an arrangement neither of us contested or found particularly surprising, given our understanding, at the time, of our identical status as her 2 biological daughters. We sold the childhood home approximately 8 months after her passing, splitting the proceeds evenly, and I took possession of a storage unit containing our mother's remaining personal belongings, photographs, letters, and various sentimental items that Renee, given her own smaller living space and busier schedule, was happy to let me manage and eventually sort through at my own pace. I want to tell you about the specific afternoon, nearly 2 years after our mother's death, when I finally found the time and emotional bandwidth to properly sort through that storage unit, because it represents the actual beginning of everything I subsequently discovered. It was a quiet Saturday in early autumn, and I had finally set aside an entire day specifically to work through the remaining boxes in that storage unit, boxes I had, admittedly, been avoiding for nearly 2 years, the particular grief of sorting through a parent's most personal belongings being something I hadn't felt fully ready to face until that specific point in my own healing process. I remember the specific quality of that storage unit, the slightly musty smell of cardboard and old paper, the single bare bulb overhead casting long shadows across boxes stacked higher than my own head. The particular quiet of a Saturday morning with no one else around except the occasional distant sound of another unit's door rolling open somewhere down the row. I had brought coffee and a playlist of my mother's favorite music, wanting, in some small way, to make the day feel less like an obligation and more like a genuine, if bittersweet, act of remembrance. Most of the boxes contained exactly what I expected. Old photographs, greeting cards Renee and I had made for our mother throughout our childhoods, various keepsakes accumulated over her 30-year teaching career. I spent the first several hours moving through these boxes with a kind of gentle, unhurried nostalgia, laughing at old school photos, setting aside a few particularly meaningful items I wanted to keep displayed in my own home. But near the bottom of one particular box, tucked beneath a stack of old photo albums, I found a small, unmarked shoebox, sealed with tape that had yellowed considerably with age, tucked away in a manner that suggested it had been deliberately hidden rather than simply forgotten among the rest of our mother's belongings. I want to describe, as clearly as I can, exactly what I found inside that shoebox, because it fundamentally reorganized my understanding of my own life within the span of about 10 minutes. Inside were several official documents, carefully preserved despite their age. A formal adoption decree, dated approximately 6 months after my birth, listing my birth name, different from the name I had grown up with, along with formal legal documentation transferring parental rights to Margaret and, notably, our father, whose name appeared on the original adoption paperwork despite his death occurring when I was only 4 years old. There was a brief letter from an adoption agency, confirming the finalization of the process, and, most significantly, a handwritten letter from our mother herself, dated the same year as the adoption decree, addressed simply, "For Anna when she's old enough to understand." I sat on the floor of that storage unit for a long time, reading and rereading these documents, understanding, slowly, disorientingly, that I had spent 32 years believing an entirely incomplete version of my own origin story, a version that our mother, it seemed, had actually always intended to eventually correct, given that she had specifically prepared a letter meant for me, an intention that, for reasons I did not yet understand, had apparently never been fulfilled during her lifetime. I want to tell you about that letter, because reading it, sitting on the concrete floor of a storage unit surrounded by boxes of my late mother's belongings, remains one of the most disorienting experiences of my entire life. Our mother wrote that she and our father had adopted me as an infant, following years of difficulty conceiving a second child after Renee's traumatic birth, complications that had left her doctors advising against further pregnancy attempts. She wrote about how much she had wanted a second child, how the adoption process had taken nearly 2 years of careful waiting, and how, from the moment she first held me, she had never once thought of me as anything other than entirely, completely her own daughter, biology notwithstanding. I remember specific phrases from that letter with a clarity that still surprises me, given how many months have passed since I first read them. She wrote, "The moment they placed you in my arms, Anna, every single fear I'd carried through those 2 years of waiting simply disappeared. You were exactly, completely mine, in every way that has ever actually mattered to me." She wrote about choosing my name specifically, a name she and our father had discussed for months before I arrived, wanting it to feel like it belonged entirely to me rather than carrying over any connection to whatever name I might have been given before joining their family. She wrote specifically that she had always intended to tell me the truth herself, at an age she felt was appropriate, likely sometime during my teenage years, understanding, even then, the importance of me knowing my own complete story rather than discovering it accidentally or having it withheld indefinitely. She wrote that she had discussed this intention with Renee directly, when Renee was around 12 years old enough, our mother believed, to understand the situation and to help support me, eventually once the truth was shared. I want to tell you what happened next in my own investigation, because understanding exactly why that intended disclosure never happened during our mother's lifetime became, for me, an urgent, almost consuming question over the following several weeks. I called Renee that same evening, still sitting in my car outside the storage facility, the shoebox on the passenger seat beside me, and I asked her directly whether she had known about my adoption throughout our childhood. I remember my hands actually trembling slightly as I dialed her number. The specific, disorienting sensation of preparing to ask a question I genuinely didn't know the answer to about a sister I had known my entire life. A strange, vertiginous uncertainty I had never experienced with Renee before that particular moment. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that I understood, before she said a single word, that the answer was considerably more complicated than a simple, immediate denial would have suggested. She told me finally that yes, she had known since she was approximately 12 years old, when our mother had specifically sat her down and explained the situation, asking for her help and understanding as our mother worked toward finding the right moment to eventually tell me directly. I asked her, my voice shaking in a way I hadn't anticipated, why, if she had known for over 2 decades, she had never once mentioned it to me, particularly in the years following our mother's death, when the truth could have been shared without any of the complicated timing considerations our mother had originally been navigating. Her answer, when it finally came, is one I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count in the months since. She said, I found the adoption papers myself, actually, Anna. When I was 17, going through Mom's desk looking for something else entirely, I found this shoebox specifically, and I took it, and I hid it in my own things, because I was afraid that if you ever saw those documents, you might feel less like my actual sister, and I didn't want that to happen. I thought, if Mom never brought it up again, maybe it would just stay quietly settled, and none of us would ever have to deal with how strange it might make things feel. I want you to sit with that answer the way I had to sit with it that evening, because I think it reveals something important, and considerably more complicated than simple cruelty, about why Renee made the choice she did. She hadn't hidden this information out of malice, exactly. She had hidden it, according to her own explanation, out of a specific, misguided fear that the truth might somehow diminish our relationship, a fear that, in practice, ended up costing me over 2 decades of understanding my own complete story, and that placed her, without my knowledge or consent, in the position of making a decision about my own life and identity that was never actually hers to make. I asked her, during that same phone call, how the shoebox had ended up back in our mother's storage boxes rather than remaining permanently hidden among Renee's own belongings. She explained that our mother had, in fact, discovered that Renee had taken the shoebox several years later, during a visit home from Renee's first year of college, and had quietly retrieved it, apparently deciding, at that point, to wait for what she considered a better moment to finally have the conversation with me directly, a moment that, tragically, her declining health and eventual death ultimately prevented from ever actually arriving. I want to tell you about the weeks following that initial phone call, because they represented some of the most disorienting emotional territory I have ever navigated, an entirely reasonable grief for the mother I had just lost being compounded by an entirely separate, equally significant grief for the complete story of my own life that I had been denied access to for over 2 decades. I want to be honest with you about the specific complications this discovery introduced regarding our mother's estate, because I think this is the part of the story that eventually revealed the true depth of what Renee had actually done, extending, it turned out, considerably beyond simply hiding documents from a curious teenage sister. Approximately 3 months after this initial discovery, working with an attorney to better understand the full implications of my adoption for various legal and family matters, I learned something that fundamentally changed my understanding of Renee's motivations, extending them well beyond a misguided, if genuinely felt, concern about our sisterly relationship. I remember sitting in my attorney's office, a careful, methodical woman named Patricia Hendricks, as she walked me through the documents she had gathered, her expression growing increasingly serious as she reached a particular folder near the bottom of her stack. She told me, before showing me anything specific, that she wanted to prepare me for information that might be genuinely difficult to process, given everything I had already been navigating over the preceding months. My attorney, reviewing the original adoption decree alongside our mother's will and the details of how our parents' estate had ultimately been divided, discovered that Renee, in the years immediately following our mother's death, had specifically consulted with her own corporate attorney colleagues regarding the legal implications of my adoption status for inheritance purposes, apparently exploring, quietly, whether my status as an adopted rather than biological daughter might provide grounds for challenging the equal division our mother's will had specified. I remember staring at the printed email correspondence Patricia slid across her desk toward me, reading my own sister's careful, professional language discussing my legal status in terms so clinical, so detached from any sense of our actual relationship, that I initially had difficulty connecting the words on that page with the sister I had grown up alongside, however distant our relationship had sometimes felt. I want to be clear about what this meant. Renee had not simply hidden the adoption papers out of an adolescent, misguided desire to protect our relationship. She had, apparently, in the years following our mother's death, specifically explored whether that same hidden information might eventually provide her legal grounds to claim a larger portion of our mother's estate than the equal division our mother's will had explicitly specified, understanding, evidently, that most jurisdictions' inheritance laws would likely still recognize an adopted child's full legal rights as equivalent to a biological child's, but exploring the question nonetheless, quietly, without ever informing me that this legal question was even being considered. My attorney found email correspondence between Renee and a colleague, discussing in general hypothetical terms initially how adoption status might affect inheritance disputes in cases where a will's language was ambiguous or silent regarding a child's legal status, correspondence that, upon closer reading, made clear that Renee was specifically applying these general legal principles to her own actual situation, exploring whether the hidden shoebox of adoption documents might eventually become useful leverage should she ever decide to challenge our estate's equal division. I want to tell you that Renee never actually did attempt to formally challenge our mother's will or the equal division we had already completed. But learning that she had specifically explored this possibility, quietly, using her professional legal expertise, while simultaneously continuing to hide the underlying adoption documents from me entirely, transformed my understanding of her original explanation considerably. What she had initially described to me as a misguided protective impulse from her teenage years increasingly appeared, upon this additional discovery, to have evolved over subsequent years into something considerably more calculated, an ongoing decision to maintain my ignorance specifically because that ignorance served her own potential financial interests, regardless of whatever genuine affection she may have also felt toward me as her sister. I confronted Renee about this second discovery during a difficult phone call approximately 4 months after our initial conversation about the shoebox itself. I told her directly that I now understood her explanation about protecting our relationship had been, at best, only part of the actual story, and that her subsequent legal exploration of using my adoption status against the estate's division suggested motivations considerably less generous than she had originally presented. Renee's response to this confrontation, I want to be honest, surprised me with its eventual candor after an initial period of defensive denial. She admitted, finally, that following our mother's death, watching me manage the bulk of our mother's final caregiving while she remained at her own comfortable distance, some part of her had genuinely resented what she perceived as my closer, more favored relationship with our mother throughout those final months, and that this resentment had, unfortunately, made the idea of leveraging the adoption information for a larger inheritance share considerably more tempting than she was initially willing to admit, even to herself. I remember that particular phone call stretching on for nearly 2 hours, considerably longer than any conversation Renee and I had shared in years, both of us working through layers of this admission slowly, carefully, with long pauses where neither of us spoke while we each processed what was being said. I asked her, at one point, whether she had ever come close to actually filing anything formal to contest the will, and she told me honestly that she had drafted preliminary language with her colleague's help, language she ultimately never submitted, deciding, in her own words, that some part of me still couldn't quite go through with actually doing it, even though I'd clearly been willing to explore whether I could. She told me during that conversation, I think some part of me wanted to believe that if you weren't really, biologically, her daughter the same way I was, that would somehow justify my own resentment about how much closer you two seemed to have become during her illness, while I was managing everything from a distance and somehow never got the same credit for it. I want to be honest that this admission, however painful, at least represented a more complete, more honest accounting of her actual motivations than her initial explanation had offered. I want to tell you about what I eventually decided to do with all of this information, because I think the resolution matters considerably more than simply cataloging the betrayal itself. I did not pursue any formal legal action against Renee, despite my attorney indicating that her exploration of contesting the will, even though she never actually filed anything, potentially raised questions about her conduct as a co-executor of our mother's estate. I made this decision carefully, over several weeks of consideration, understanding that whatever additional financial or legal consequences I might theoretically pursue would likely cost both of us considerably more, in time, money, and whatever remained of our relationship, than any actual benefit I might realistically gain. What I did do, instead, was insist on a full, honest accounting between us, a series of difficult conversations over several months where Renee and I worked through, as completely as we could manage, exactly what had happened, why, and what it meant for whatever relationship we might eventually be able to rebuild between us going forward. I also did something I had not initially planned to do when I first discovered that shoebox. I contacted the adoption agency listed in the original documents, working over several additional months, to learn what I could about my own biological origins, a process that eventually connected me with distant biological relatives I had never known existed, including a biological aunt who was able to share some general medical history information that proved genuinely useful for my own healthcare going forward. Information I had, unknowingly, been missing for over 3 decades simply because the adoption itself had remained hidden from me for so long. I want to tell you about that first phone call with my biological aunt, a woman named Diane who lived several states away and who received my initial inquiry with a warmth and openness I hadn't necessarily expected, given how little either of us knew about the other beyond our shared biological connection to a birth mother who, I learned during that same call, had passed away herself nearly a decade earlier. Diane told me about a family medical history I had never known existed, a pattern of early-onset heart disease on my biological mother's side, that my own doctor, once informed, adjusted my preventive screening schedule to account for immediately, a genuinely practical benefit that emerged directly from finally accessing the complete story Renee had kept hidden from me for so long. I did not seek, during this process, any kind of replacement relationship for the family I had grown up within, understanding that Margaret would always remain, entirely and completely, my actual mother in every way that mattered most to me. But learning these additional pieces of my own biological history felt, nonetheless, like recovering something genuinely valuable, a fuller, more complete understanding of my own life that I believe every person deserves access to, regardless of how that access is eventually gained. I want to tell you about a specific conversation I eventually had with Renee, nearly a year after that initial discovery, because I think it represents the closest thing to genuine resolution this particular story has offered, even if that resolution remains, admittedly, imperfect and ongoing rather than fully complete. We met for dinner, the first time we had seen each other in person since the difficult months of phone conversations following my initial discovery, and Renee told me, with what struck me as genuine, hard-won honesty, that she had spent considerable time in therapy over the preceding months, working through her own complicated feelings about our childhood, about our father's early death, and the specific ways she believed it had shaped an ongoing insecurity about her own place within our small family. An insecurity that, she now recognized, had made the arrival of an adopted younger sister, however genuinely loved, into something she had never fully processed or made peace with, even decades later. I remember that dinner taking place at a quiet restaurant neither of us had any particular history with, deliberately chosen, I think by both of us, as neutral ground for a conversation we both understood carried considerable weight. Renee looked different to me somehow, or perhaps I simply noticed her differently, watching her speak with a kind of careful vulnerability I had rarely witnessed from her throughout our entire adult relationship, her usual controlled professional composure visibly softened by the specific work she described doing in therapy over recent months. She told me she understood, finally, that hiding the truth from me for over 2 decades, and later exploring whether that same hidden truth might benefit her financially, represented 2 separate but related failures she took full responsibility for, without asking me to simply forgive or forget what had happened as a condition of continuing our relationship going forward. I asked her, near the end of that dinner, what she hoped our relationship might eventually look like going forward, given everything that had happened. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, and then she said, "I don't think I get to ask for anything specific, Anna. I think I just want to keep showing up honestly, for as long as it takes for you to decide whether that's actually worth something to you." I appreciated that answer considerably more than I expected to, understanding that it represented a genuine shift away from the careful, managed version of herself she had presented throughout most of our adult relationship, towards something considerably more honest, however imperfect and still developing. That honesty remained. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now, nearly 3 years removed from that afternoon in the storage unit. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated resolution, the way you might expect from a story that offers this kind of late, hard-won honesty. I feel instead something considerably more complicated, genuine grief for 2 decades of my own life, lived without access to my complete story, alongside a cautious, still developing understanding with Renee that neither of us fully trusts yet, but that both of us seem willing to continue slowly building, one honest, difficult conversation at a time. We speak now, Renee and I, perhaps twice monthly, conversations that carry a different quality than anything we shared throughout most of our adult lives before this discovery. More honest, if also more careful. Both of us clearly working to build something neither of us fully knows how to build yet, given how little practice either of us has had with this particular kind of vulnerable, ongoing honesty. She visited me last spring, staying for an entire week rather than her usual brief weekend visits. And we spent several afternoons going through old family photographs together, Renee pointing out memories I had genuinely forgotten, small moments of ordinary childhood closeness that existed alongside, and somehow despite, everything more complicated that eventually developed between us. I keep the shoebox itself in my own home now. In a drawer in my bedroom, the original documents preserved carefully, alongside the additional information I've since gathered about my biological origins. I take it out occasionally, still, turning through those papers slowly, understanding that this particular object, small and unremarkable as it appears, fundamentally reshaped my understanding of my own life, in ways both painful and, ultimately, I believe, genuinely clarifying. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Withholding someone's own truth from them, however well-intentioned the original impulse might seem, is never actually a form of protection. It is, however gently framed, a decision made on someone else's behalf about what they deserve to know about their own life. And that decision, regardless of intent, ultimately serves the person, making it considerably more than the person it claims to protect. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since that afternoon in the storage unit. Motivations are rarely as simple as they first appear, even to the people holding them. Renee's initial explanation, a misguided teenage impulse to protect our closeness, was genuinely part of the truth, but it was never the complete truth, and I think many complicated family betrayals contain exactly this same layered structure, a kernel of genuine, even loving intention, gradually complicated and compromised by less generous motivations that develop and calcify over subsequent years. Here is a third truth. Documentation, once again, changes everything. If that shoebox had never survived, quietly stored among our mother's other belongings, I might never have learned my own complete story at all. I think about how easily those documents could have been discarded, accidentally or deliberately, and I feel a specific, quiet gratitude toward our mother for preserving them so carefully, even during the years when circumstances prevented her from sharing them with me directly herself. Here is a fourth truth. Vindication does not require complete severance of the relationship that caused the harm. I chose not to pursue legal action against Renee, and I chose eventually to continue working towards some version of rebuilt trust between us. Not because what she did was acceptable, but because I decided for myself that the version of justice most meaningful to me involved genuine accountability and ongoing honest conversation, rather than punishment or permanent estrangement. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the truth about our own lives arrives decades later than it should have, carried in an unmarked shoebox at the bottom of a storage unit, discovered entirely by accident on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. However late that truth arrives, and however painful the discovery of who withheld it and why, it remains. I have come to believe considerably better to finally know your own complete story than to continue living, indefinitely, inside someone else's carefully curated version of who you're allowed to understand yourself to be. That is my story. 20 years of a hidden truth, one unmarked shoebox, and a slow, imperfect, ongoing process of finally understanding both my own complete origin and the complicated, layered reasons someone I love decided, for over 2 decades, that this truth was theirs to control rather than mine to know. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that the truth about your own life is never something someone else has the right to permanently withhold, I would love to hear from you. Tell me, in your own words, about a time you discovered something significant about your own life that someone close to you had known for years without ever telling you. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story.